All right, thank you for that lovely introduction. I apologize for starting a little late. I'll try to stay in the time that I've been allotted, about 40 minutes. I will begin by thanking my students and collaborators without whom this work would not have been done. A lot of the work here has been done by my grad students, especially in the case of the Salience annotation project, Jessica Lin. You can see their work on our lab website and on GitHub. And I'd also like to say that our lab is constantly changing and growing. We are actively recruiting PhD students. I think in my Coptic talk, I gave the impression that we're an impoverished university. We are not. We just had a grant on Coptic canceled, but we do have money to accept grad students with full funding. So if you're looking for a place to do a PhD in computational linguistics, please consider it. I'll start by talking a little bit about prominence, even though the topic of this talk is actually salience, and I'll try to distinguish the two. So in subject prominent languages like English, people talk about the subject having a special position. You can see this across all levels of linguistic representation. In phonology, we get heavy NP shift and expletives. In morphosyntax, we see that subjects have special agreement with verbs. In argument structure, there are special operations to turn, for example, proto-patients into more prominent arguments by passivizing. In information structure, subjects typically convey discourse-given information. They are typically the aboutness topics of a sentence. And for me, the most important part is that in discourse and pragmatics, there's this idea that important participants in a text will be realized as subjects. To show what this means, sort of in one summary example of all of the above, consider some sort of propositional content, such as kids playing in a park with a ball next to some trees at a certain time of the day. The first sentence on the slide is a pretty normal way of saying that. The kids played with the ball in a park next to some trees until 5 p.m. Pretty normal sentence. The second sentence, which expresses very similar propositional content, even though the predication is a little bit different, may sound quite odd. For example, in the park, 5 p.m. was the time when some kids played ball next to some trees. It's a much more unusual and much more unlikely sentence if you measure its surprisal or whatever you like. But it's not an impossible sentence, and in a certain context, it's quite logical. For example, if we're discussing an alibi question, so it's very important what was happening at 5 p.m., and 5 p.m. is the most important participant in this particular fragment of text, then this is a quite natural way of saying it, perhaps. Now I'd like to move from sentential prominence to discourse salience. So most of the definitions that talk about linguistic prominence apply within a sentence. I'm going to rank the participant in a sentence by some sort of prominence, and the subject will be most important. But discourse salience is something different. Discourse salience means standing out not in a sentence, but in an entire document, which I'm using as a broad term. It can be a conversation, it can be a written text. And following this definition from Charcos and Stede, for example, degree of prominence of attention an entity is assigned in the discourse, right? A total holistic one. And this can have a lot of different empirical reflexes. For example, people have better recall or faster reading times, different listening behaviors to prominent entities. For example, if I have a story with 20 people mentioned, the protagonist or most salient character will be the one that they remember. If I ask, who was at the party in this story, there's maybe one character that's more salient than others. You can see reflexes of increased attention, faster accessibility, and pressing buttons to say whether that person was in the story and so on. There are many, many reflexes of this overall importance, not in a certain sentence. So the question I'd like to ask today is what makes something salient in discourse? And this immediately runs into a problem, which is definitional. As pointed out by Bostwick and Kohler, even when definitions of salience are given, they are often circular because people use text internal criteria. For example, if you think that subjects are more prominent, as in the previous slide, then you could say, well, the most salient entity in the text is the one that's realized as the subject the most often. Seems very reasonable, right? Well, what you just did prevents any kind of corpus linguistic study of this phenomenon because so many things correlate with that. First, if you looked at UD labels for this, you would discover, the most salient one is in subj. Okay, but you define salience as subjects. Okay, let's say I put that to the side because that's trivial. You looked maybe at definiteness, you looked at surprisal, you looked at pronominalization, you looked at NP length. Any one of these correlates so strongly with whether or not you're the subject that you're just rediscovering your definition of salience. It's meaningless. This is why I think we absolutely need to have an extra linguistic definition of salience to study this question. So my sort of preliminary research question will be, can we operationalize salience for entities using extra textual criteria, which I would also like to be domain general, because I would like to be able to study this in text, in speech, in any kind of context. Second of all, if we can find such a definition, how can we obtain not just yes, no salience ratings, but scores? Because I think it's a relative thing to be salient. And what kind of linguistic properties signal these scores will be sort of my main question, or the reason why I'm posing this question and trying to find this data. Once I have some sort of model of what signals salience, I can try to build models and interpret them. I can try to see if I can predict salience given some text. Can you tell me what humans will find salient? And then I can try to see where these models succeed, where they fail, and what new things I can learn about salience from these successes and failures. I'll give a quick overview of previous approaches to extra-textual operationalizations of salience. The audience in this room would probably think, why not annotate it, right? A lot of us are engaged in annotation. It has two big advantages. One, it's domain general. Any kind of text can be annotated. I could just ask the annotator, here's a conversation, what's salient? And it's also graded because I can say, can you rate it from 1 to 10? Or can you say very salient, somewhat salient, not salient? The problem with this approach is that it will never have high agreement. Multiple studies have shown that people do not agree on what is salient, perhaps because they come with different expectations and backgrounds to the text, but it's not a task on which you can get high inter-annotator agreement. This has led to people trying to find more behavioral definitions of salience. For example, clickstream data. So if you look at some texts on the internet in an information retrieval context, if people are looking for a certain entity and they click on a certain document, then it must be salient in that document, stuff like that. If you have a lot of data, it can actually produce interesting results. Similarly, you can look at things like hyperlinks. So things that have hyperlinks are more salient in a Wikipedia article than things that don't have hyperlinks. Or you can look at the categories within Wikipedia, all sorts of things. One immediate problem with this is that it's not domain general. You can't do this on a conversation. And in the case of hyperlinks, it's also not graded. For clickstream data, it's actually nice and quantitative. But I also don't think that it really gets to the bottom of what we consider to be salience. It maybe correlates with salience, but it is not the phenomenon itself. Finally, there's an approach based on summarization, which will be the one that I'll focus on today, which is to say, if something is salient in a text, it will be close to impossible to write a summary of the text without mentioning it. All right, so this approach basically equates salience with summary worthiness. There are two problems with this approach. One, it might be relatively objective whether something appears in both the summary and the document. Maybe humans can agree on that. Spoiler, they can agree on that. But the summary itself is subjective. Two, there is no obvious way to obtain relative scores from this. Either something appears in the summary or it does not. To get past both of these problems, we consider the idea that we can use multiple summaries. To illustrate how this could work, consider this example, which is taken from a Reddit post discussing the movie Batman versus Superman. The film Snyder showed the studio execs in 2015 was without a doubt the original cut, the 3-hour UE. I guess management needed to be part of the production from its scripting stages. Let me get a quick show of hands. Who thinks that its scripting stages is the most salient entity in this text? Anybody? Anybody like the scripting stages as the most salient? How about the film Schneider showed the studio execs in mid-2015? The film itself? 1 hand, 2 hand, 3. Oh, okay, more hands. How about Snyder? Some hands, slightly fewer hands. How about 3 hours? Okay, this is an interesting experiment to do. Now let's look at how summaries behave. Here's one summary of this text, or part of it. Some people debate whether the original 3-hour cut of Snyder's movie about Batman and Superman should have been released instead of the shorter version. So this does include the movie and Snyder, which many of you picked as the most salient entity. Unfortunately, it also contains the 3 hours, which is maybe less salient. Okay, let's look at another summary. The author believes that the film about Batman and Superman was unevenly delivered and that the studio's decision to shorten the film was a mistake. It does mention the film. It also mentions the studio and the author of the post, which is there in sort of orange color, but it doesn't mention the 3 hours. Maybe now you're starting to see what I'm getting at. The more summaries you have, the more these coincidences will balance out, but I don't think there will be any summary that doesn't mention the movie. And there will probably be quite a few summaries that mention the director. And one of them will mention that it's 3 hours long. So basically, salience will be summary worthiness as a concept. And for a score of salience, I will be using the number of summaries mentioning something. To do this, we collected summaries for the GUM corpus as well as its complementary challenge test set, Gentle, which I'll talk about in a second. These are 2 Treebanks. And we discovered that if you give people gold annotation spans for entities, they can agree very, very well on whether or not an entity appears in the summary. I'll leave aside the question of whether people agree on spans for entities. That's a more complex question. But in this case, fortunately, the corpus already had entity annotation. So I just said, here are the boxes, Snyder, the film, and so on. Tell me which ones appear in the summary. And on that, people agree quite easily. We also experimented with predicting this automatically in various ways. This is not an NLP talk, so I won't talk about that. If you're curious, I can tell you how well GPT does in this and so on. We ended up having 5 human summaries for the test and dev sets of the treebank. And for the training set, we got 1 human summary and 4 LLM summaries. And I'll work with this data in this talk. I'll introduce the data briefly. For those of you who don't know GUM and Gentle, GUM is the Georgetown University multi-layer corpus, which Heike mentioned. It's a corpus that's created in Georgetown as part of our curriculum. When I teach corpus linguistics every year, the students build this corpus. And the idea is we learn about different annotation frameworks, and students pick a document at the beginning of the semester. And as we learn what is pos tagging, they tag their document. As we learn what is UD, they do UD analysis of their document, discourse parses, entities, coreference. By now, it has more annotations, I think, than fit on this slide. If you look at the Connell-U MISC field, you'll find that it's very laden for this corpus. And a lot of these things get built up in lab projects by the grad students then. In terms of contents, the core corpus GUM has at present 16 genres. We change genres every couple of years. Some of them are written, some of them are spoken. Next to classics like news and, I don't know, biographies, we also have vlogs from YouTube, face-to-face conversations, travel guides from Wikivoyage, how-to guides from WikiHow, and so on. The Gentle corpus is a disjoint set of 8 genres, which is meant to be a challenge set. And some of the genres are quite strange. They include live esports commentary and poetry and, I don't know, mathematical proofs. And I hope I'll convince you if our models generalize to this test set that they've never seen, that probably they're strong and robust models. So now I come to my actual first question. Are subjects significantly more salient? This is the question I started with. Subjects are prominent. Are they more salient? It's very easy to check using a multi-layer tree bank. I have the grammatical functions from UD. I have the entities. I have the salience ratings. And the answer is yes. You get a high t-value, maximal p-value that we can measure using R and a decent effect size. So we can go home now, right? We can all go home. The slides 11 is the last slide of this talk, and the talk is over. Probably not so fast, for several reasons. So the first reason I already alluded to with the circular definitions of salience, being a subject correlates with a whole mess of other things. Subjects appear early in a sentence in English. They are often definite. They are most often pronouns compared to other grammatical functions. They are usually singular, not plural. Maybe it's any one of those things, right? Is it really that subjects are more salient? Luckily, all of this is annotated, so we can just check. For the regression models in this talk, I'll be using beta binomial regression, which is a good way of modeling a score of 0 to 5, because each one of those is a success in binomial sense. So either you are mentioned in a summary or you failed to be mentioned in the summary, and this target distribution then is modeled naturally as 0 to 5. These are single-term deletions from a multifactorial model, and you can see that all of the things I included in the model are significant. This is perhaps not super surprising given the amount of data that I have, because we have, I believe, about 75,000 mentions in the corpus and something like 50,000 distinct entities that they represent. And so everything is significant, and I'm ranking everything by AIC. So, okay, position in sentence is the least significant, but it's still very significant. Then definiteness, then position in the document. And the very most significant thing that we have is the dependency relation over here. Here's part of speech. Now, you can model this in different ways. You can model, instead of part of speech, you can take is pronoun. Instead of dependency relation, you can take is subject as a binary predictor. Either of those would also be significant, right? So you can take it as a multifactorial variable or, multinomial variable or just binary. So can we go home? Not necessarily, because I happen to ask whether subjects are salient. That doesn't mean that subjects are the most salient. Why did you think it was subjects? Why not check the other ones? So what this plot shows is, I don't have space for all the UD relations, it's too big. But on the right, you have the 5 bottom least salient ones. And there's a nice sanity check here. Here's expletives. If expletives were not the bottom, this would be a very bad indication of the sanity of our annotations. But expletives are the single least salient function you could have. Seems reasonable. Okay, but where is subject? So the top 5 features subjects in 4th place. All right, only in 4th place. And all of the confidence intervals here are GLHT adjusted using generalized linear hypothesis testing. That means that if error bars don't overlap between 2 bars, they're different significantly. So for example, possessives are significantly more salient than subjects and mod pos. And also you can see the percentage of mentions with these functions that have salience equals 5. 42% of possessives have a salience of 5. That's really mentioned in every single summary. That's quite surprising. Why? Next is vocative, and next is indirect object. I can take shouts from the audience. Does anybody know what these functions have in common? Yes, very good. Absolutely. Not just animate, they're usually humans. And so if you look at this biography example, Johann Bernoulli also plagiarized some key ideas from Daniel's book, Hydrodynamica. If you're a possessor of something, it's highly likely that you're human. If you're a vocative, it's even more likely that you're human. There's 12 examples of vocatives directed at not humans in the corpus, and most of them are animals. It doesn't hurt, Graham, Renata says. This is from fiction. If you look at the summaries for these, yeah, Daniel Bernoulli was an 18th century Swiss mathematician, of course. And Graham is the protagonist's mother, and she's a character in this story. Somebody's talking to her, so she's probably going to get mentioned in the summary. Not surprising. Okay, so people are more salient. We can forget about the subject thing, right? Let's try that. So here's the mean salience by entity type, and people are indeed in the lead. They are not fourth. This is a more reliable cue than being the subject. They're significantly different. Again, no overlapping error bars, pairwise. And I also like that it follows the animacy hierarchy quite closely. So animals are second, and then organizations, which I would argue are like sort of semi-animate, inanimate or abstract entities. And the least animate, perhaps times and abstracts are the bottom. If you wanted plants to be third because they're alive, then that's a bit disappointing, but plants are very non-agentive, so I guess that makes sense. So, okay, being people matters, and that's sort of the end of it, right? Well, you should ask yourselves, but is it always so? This is a plot. So at the bottom left now, you see the same plot from the previous slide, just squished. It's the same one, that people are the most salient. What I did here is I took all the genres in the corpus and I tested their order of entity salience and by entity type. And I picked the one that had the highest Spearman correlation with the ordering from the entire corpus and the one that had the lowest correlation by Spearman correlation with the entire corpus. A really shocking finding for me was that there is no single genre in a corpus of 24 genres that has the same ordering as the overall corpus. Not that that's quite hard. If I had enough genres, eventually by chance, one of them would do it, right? None of them have the exact same ordering. And the one that's closest is actually Reddit forum discussions, which are quite diverse in topic. And some of the things that are bad are that the ranks 2, 3, and 4 are sort of a little bit messed up, but the error bars are pretty big. There's just less data when you don't take the entire corpus. Plants are never mentioned in these, so I guess we don't really know, but it's a fairly similar picture. The most deviating genre is travel guides. Would it surprise you if I told you that places are the most prominent thing in travel guides, right? So, but what? If you mention a person, it won't be prominent in it. When do you mention a person in a travel guide? The city founded by conquistador so-and-so. Okay, great. But is that going to make it into the summary? Probably not, right? It's in a tangential background part. So you really need to know what kind of text it is. And you can't just say being a person makes you salient. It really depends. There are just a lot of text kinds where that's true, but it's not always true. It's not an inherently salient. Maybe it's somewhat inherently salient. So there are a lot of one-way implications. Possessives, indirect objects, and vocatives are really interesting. Why are they not discussed more in the literature as prominent functions? Well, the main reason is that they're rare. Possessives are just 5% of the data. Vocatives and indirect objects are less than 1%. They're quite rare. And really subjects, what's really more striking about them is that despite being 25% of the data, they're still highly correlated with salience. So they're both common and it's not trivial like for the other ones. If you look at the best represented top 5 salient function ranks, 43% of rank 5 salient entities end up being subjects, and 36% of people are rank 5 salients. So that's a nice finding, okay, subjects and people. But the inverse is not always true. Only 29% of subjects have salience 5, and in fact, nearly 60% of subjects have a salience of 0. So how can you say that subjects are salient when 60% of them have a salience of 0? Maybe the problem is that some sentences are just not very important. And the problem is that in English, at least, nearly every sentence has a subject. So you have to do something with those subjects and they're not important. The whole sentence is not important. So nobody in that sentence is important. The hypothesis is therefore that subjects and perhaps people are sometimes just mentioned in unimportant parts of the text, and this reduces our correlations. Could very well be. So here's an example. In the following drawing, the green spheres represent atoms of a certain element. This is out of a textbook on atomic theory. It's a figure. It's an example. Nobody's going to mention this figure. And even if they did, they wouldn't mention the green spheres. But it's a sentence and it has a subject. So maybe we can control for this if we can rate the importance of each part of text. To do this, I'm going to use a very different type of tree banking. For those of you who don't know it, I'll explain briefly what discourse parsers are. This is a tree from the enhanced rhetorical structure theory data in the GUM corpus. And it's basically the same as a syntax tree. Instead of using words as the leaves, it uses clauses as the leaves, propositions. So here we have, on Friday, fishermen rescued over 700 asylum seekers whose boat sank, and the Indonesian Navy reportedly saved 200 more. That's 3 verbs, 3 clauses in a way. And they did this after they were found swimming along the coast of Aceh, Indonesia. Now, you can probably notice that not all of these propositions are as important as each other. The most important part is that some asylum seekers were rescued. The fact that this happened after they were found swimming, blah, 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 is probably less important. Even less important is this sentence over here, which is marked as an elaboration. Major General Fuad Basya said fishermen first noticed the people and a warship was deployed to retrieve them. Okay, that's like details, an elaboration. One way of measuring the importance of elements in this kind of graph is how many sideways hops are they away from the root of the graph. So for example, can you see it? This circumstance clause number 6 has 1 horizontal hop over here. Do you see that? This one, number 3, has no horizontal hops. It doesn't point towards anything else. In fact, everything points directly or indirectly towards 3 and 5, which are sort of a coordination over here. 4 points to 3, 6 points to 3, 4, 5. This sentence here also points to the same root, and you can count these hops. So I would call 3 and 5 the most important or central discourse units because they have a depth of 0. We call this depth, so 0 hops to the side. These units have a depth of 1 because they have 1 hop to the side, and some even have a depth of 2. So for example, this one here, which is a purpose satellite, is 1 hop to get to the purpose of deploying the warship. And then this entire sequence here is an elaboration on this story here, so that's the 2nd hop. So it has a depth of 2. Does that make sense? The graph includes a bunch of other things, such as marking where there are discourse markers, marking a relation. So some relations are marked by these red highlighted words like and or after, and some aren't. And there are other cues that you can tell, oh, this is an attribution because there's the word said here, which is the source of the information and so on. But I'll put that to the side for the moment. So I can ask, do salient entities appear less deep in the graph? So the idea would be that salient entities should live in places like Unit 3 and Unit 5. Like the asylum seekers, and less salient entities like Major General Fuad Basya should live in depth 2, right? And it's absolutely true. All right, so there's a difference in mean depth for all mentions, never minding how you count. Do you count the first mention of every entity? We can tell because we have coreference annotations. Do you count all mentions? Do you count the minimally deep mention, the minimum depth that some entity achieved across all of its mentions? Because Fuad Basya might later be mentioned in a very important sentence. Any way you count, there's a significant difference. You can also see that the labels themselves correspond to significant differences. And these things are not independent of things that I've said. So for example, salient functions include attribution, organization, and context. You don't know all of these labels yet, obviously. But you've just seen attribution. You remember? Attribution is where Major General Fuad Basya said something. So attribution supplies the source of the information. Guess what? People supply sources of information. Attributions almost always contain speakers. Speakers are humans, and we've already established that humans are more salient. So none of the facts that I'm showing you are independent of each other. The question is only, are they all significant when you put them together, right? Organization is typically headlines. Context can be temporal circumstances. Less salient functions include explanations. So if you're giving supporting evidence, evidence that something is true, justifying why something is so, that wouldn't make it into the summary. You'll say X is true. The reason I know this is blah, 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 but that won't appear in the summary. It's less summary worthy. Similarly, elaborations are often optional. Adversative clauses are things like concessions. So although X, Y, Z, they often give a counterpoint to what you actually want to say, and so they don't end up in the summary. And here you see these significant differences in a residual plot. Okay, so far everything that I've talked about is what I'll call an instance-based property of entity mentions. They apply at a certain position where something is mentioned at the text. One mention can either be the subject or it's not the subject. But you can't say that about the entire entity across all of its mentions, right? Some of its mentions were subjects and some weren't. These are entity-based properties. And there are some really useful entity-based properties. First of all, I'll give you a really obvious one, number of mentions. If you're mentioned many times in a document, probably you're more important than something that's mentioned few times. Okay, how about dispersion? For two entities that are mentioned 5 times, what if I tell you that all 5 mentions are in one sentence versus one in the first 20% of the document, one in the second 20% of the document? So 5 entities, 5 mentions, the same count, but dispersed across the whole document. Seems more salient, right? Because it's mentioned everywhere. How about this metric I mentioned earlier, the minimum EDU depth? So EDU is elementary discourse unit, the minimum discourse tree depth that you ever achieved across the entire graph of the document. So if you're more shallow somewhere, then you're more salient. Again, this is entity-based because it doesn't rely on just a single mention. It's for all mentions of the entity. You can also formulate a special type of entity-based feature, which is a transition-based feature. A good example of this is centering theory, if you know it. If you don't, I'll give a very brief overview in a second. For example, you can check whether there are consecutive mentions. So if your longest chain of mentions is 5 in a row, 5 sentences in a row, something like that. I'll start with cluster size. So how many times you've been mentioned. This is super obvious. If you've been mentioned 8 or more times, then you're over here on the right. That's insanely more salient. Your mean salient score is about 3. If you're only mentioned once, your mean salient score is like 0.2. Okay, so being mentioned a lot is important, right? But there are other significant correlations with entity-based properties that go beyond number of mentions. Dispersion is one of them. The more mentions you have, the more likely you are to be across the document. And we measure this as Kullback-Leibler divergence across the entire document, measured in quantiles. And actually, that has a really strong correlation. These are Pearson correlations with the salience score. This is dispersion. This is number of mentions, normalized as a percentile, because if a document has a very different length, it doesn't make sense to compare 10 mentions from a really long document with 5 mentions from half as long a document. So we just do it as a percentile. First mention EDU depth. So this is the discourse tree depth, also pretty strong. What about those transition features? Well, for this, I need to introduce very briefly what centering theory is. I don't have a lot of time, so I'll do this very shallowly with apologies to those who love centering theory. The basic idea is that every sentence has a ranked list of entities participating in it, and they're ranked by a variety of form-based criteria. For example, subjects outrank objects, early outranks late, definite outranks indefinite, pronouns outrank non-pronouns, and so on. So in a sentence like Susie gave Betsy a pet hamster, the ranking is Susan over Betsy over hamster. And this ranking is called CF, for forward-looking center. So Susan is CF1. In the second sentence, she asked whether Betsy liked the gift. We again have a CF ranking, which could be different from the previous sentence. And importantly, we now also have a backwards-looking center, CB. The backwards-looking center is the most anaphoric element in the sentence, in this case, the pronoun she. And then centering compares pairs of adjacent sentences. For example, if CF1 of the previous sentence is the same as the CB of this sentence, we call that transition narration. And this is a typical transition for things like Kim walked into the room. She saw Mark, right? This is a typical narration, continuation transition. There are, in some versions of the theory, up to 7 transition types based on the relationship between the CF and CB of 2 sentences. And the other types are considered to be less coherent or less prominent marking. Right now, I'm going to treat this as a numerical variable where continue, the most salient transition is 1, retain is 2. Retain would be something like Kim walked into the room, Mark saw her, in which Mark is now the subject, but the pronoun referring back is the object, and so on. If we use centering features, the most correlated one with salience seems to be the proportion of times that an entity has been CB, right? That's 0.52, about as strong as dispersion. You can also use the mean CF rank that something has had, or the minimum centering transition in which it's been participating. So if you have ever been a continue, then you get 1. If you've ever been a retain, you get a 2, and so on. Actually, the CB proportion turns out to be a red herring. I don't know if anybody can guess why, but the reason is if you've ever been CB, that means that you have more than 1 mention because you're anaphoric. So actually in a multifactorial model, including CB proportion, but also taking into account the number of mentions, CB is totally non-significant. This is also to convince you maybe that not everything that I put into these models is significant because I have a lot of data. It's really obvious here. It's completely useless as long as you know the cluster size, so how many mentions. And actually, the minimum transition in centering ends up being the most informative. This is possibly because it collapses a lot of information from 2 sentences at the same time. Okay, now it's sort of time to start stopping introducing new predictors and start combining them. Can we combine these instance-based and entity-based properties? It's not hard to run a multifactorial model. This is a mixed effects model. The predictors are sorted by their AIC, so how informative they are. There's a random effect for which document the data comes from. And you see that everything I've looked at so far is significant in the same model together, except for position in sentence. If you know all of the other things I've mentioned so far, then which position you are in sentence, like how early in the sentence you are, stops being significant, although it's quite borderline. It gets down to a p-value of like almost 5%, very borderline. The rest are ranked. So it wouldn't surprise you perhaps that the most significant are cluster divergence, which is the dispersion, and cluster size, which is how many times you've been mentioned. They're by far the most important things. They're way more important than whether or not you're a subject. I'm sorry. But, so where is subject? No. Dependency relation. It's there, it's in the middle, but there are many other things that are more important than it. And the same is true for being a pronoun, which is in the part of speech. It's, it ranks fifth. There are other things. The centering things do better than that, which is kind of surprising, perhaps. And entity type is also above being a subject. So being a person is more important than being a subject. All right, for this basic model. It's not a bad model. It has a pretty strong fit based on conditional R-squared. It has a decent root mean square error. It's only off by 1.23 scores on average. It's a decent model, but it's a pretty dumb model. The only purpose of this model is to see if these things survive together, if they're all significant. But it's an additive linear model. It can't model any kind of interaction. Very, very basic. So instead, we can look at some more complex models. The linear model predicts 69% accurately if you binarize this task. So binarize means, is my salience more than 0? Am I summary worthy for some summary? And for that task, the linear model will get you 69.8% over a baseline of 63.5. Not bad. But we can use better models. For example, we can use tree ensembles. For those of you who don't know them, these are models that are based on very simple decision trees. They pick a variable at the first node and then find the optimal threshold to achieve maximum purity of division. So for example, this tiny tree with 4 bins starts by asking whether a mention's cluster divergence is greater than 0.8. If it isn't, meaning that it's present in a lot of the document, then it says, yes, it probably will be salient. And I say this because for data like this, 79% of the time it was salience above 0, and 21% of the time it was not salient. So it's good to guess yes. If this test is true, though, I will ask a second question. Is the divergence also above 8.88? So you notice it uses the same variable twice, which it's allowed. If this ends up being false, then it asks a different question. Is the minimum depth percentile in the discourse graph above 22? Right, so it keeps asking questions. And we can take 100 trees like this, give them all different variables to work with, give them all different subsets of the data to work with, and then take the majority vote as to whether something will end up being salient or not. Here's a ranking of the importance of each predictor in the model according to 2 metrics. The Gini index, which represents how much purity was achieved, so good separability by using a variable, and MDA, mean decrease accuracy, which tells you how much worse the model will be in prediction accuracy if that predictor is absent. Right, so it's an ablation-based importance. The rankings are slightly different, but I've ranked them now by the mean z-score of both of them together. And this shows you that without any doubt, the single most important predictor is cluster divergence, aka dispersion, followed by number of mentions, cluster size. Okay, we already knew that. But here things become a little bit more interesting. Minimum depth, minimum transition, genre, above entity type, above part of speech, and here's dependency relation. I don't have time to go over all of these results in great detail, but I do want to point something strange out, the genre. So why is genre 5th? Even entity type, being a person or not, doesn't manage to score 5th. That's really surprising. Genre is 5th. Dependency relation is a distant 12th. Why does it matter so much what genre the data comes from, which is sort of a main interest of mine and the reason why we build this corpus with so many genres? Well, let me give you an intuition. If I tell you Oakland nurtured novelists Amy Tan and Maya Angelou, who do you think is the most salient thing in this sentence? If I tell you that it's part of a biography, probably you wouldn't think that Oakland is very salient. If I tell you that it's a travel guide, this is probably another fact about Oakland. All right, and yes, Oakland is the subject, but I think it would change your minds just knowing which genre it is, which corresponds to those plots I had earlier that show that the entity type rankings vary very widely by genre. And unlike the linear model, this model can combine. It can first ask what genre it is, split. Then I'll ask different things. Another way of observing this is shuffling the genre predictions and seeing where the model changes its mind. So we can take the model that is already trained knowing about genre, and then we can give it all correct data or unseen data, but only flip the genre value to be a random value and see what breaks down. So for example, before the model knows the correct genre, it considers this non-salient. You're so stupid thinking I spent the night. I don't know, it's a pronoun, it's first person. I think this person maybe doesn't speak that much in this conversation, so number of mentions is not huge. But as soon as you tell it it's a conversation, then it goes, yeah, it's a participant in a conversation, right? So a pronoun like I should be significantly predicted to be salient, but only if you know that it's a conversation. Wikinews interviews meteorological experts on Cyclone Phelan. This is the first sentence. This is the heading of an interview. Before it knows that it's an interview, it says it's not salient. It's a one-word length. It knows about length. It knows, if you look carefully at my predictors, there's a bunch of things that it knows. It also knows how deep into this document this is. If you tell it it's an interview, it says, you're telling me this is a named entity, so part of speech prop N, which is in the first sentence of an interview. It's an organization. Wait, I know. This is who's doing the interview. It's seen this pattern before. It knows to predict that it's salient. There's also the opposite. If you hear a lot of awkward pauses or uhs or ums, your joke isn't ready. This is from the how-to guide, how to tell a joke. Initially, the model sees you, thinks maybe it's a participant. This participant is mentioned quite a lot, this generic you. If you tell it it's a how-to guide, the probability drops below 50% and it knows it's not salient. Because this pattern comes up a lot. It's the generic you. It appears in how-to guides and nobody mentions this fictitious person in the summary. They just say what the guide says. If you are interested in the kinds of salient entities that emerge from this, I just maybe convince you that there's this profile, the generic you, it's special, right? You need to know about it. Can we find profiles like that just by looking at the data quantitatively? What we can do is we can take the same features that we fed to the multifactorial model, to the tree-based ensemble, and then apply some sort of clustering techniques to find regions in space which have similar mentions. Here I'm using TSNE, T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, but you could use other techniques as well. Here's a representation of the space in which our entities live. It's a bit complex, but I'll try to go over what the view means. The colors are the entity types. Because it's so much data, I've reduced it to the 5 most common types: place, person, organization, object, and abstract. So this red crescent over here are the abstracts, and the purples are people. All right. Then the entity is salient if it has a full circle, and if it's empty, it's not salient. The size of the circle means how many mentions does it have, so cluster size by percentile. And there's also a shading that's a bit hard to see. If the background shading is an orange tile, then it's mainly written data. If it's green, then it's mainly spoken data. These are not the only variables, it's just what I could cram into that image. So let me give you an example of what this reads like. Consider the people crescent at the bottom, the purples. There are several clusters. There's sort of 6 main hotspots for these, which I've labeled P1 through P6. And then I can take examples that are nearest to the centroid of that region. So for example, region P2 is the region that clusters protagonists, especially from written data and mostly fiction. So this is that one protagonist that keeps appearing in consecutive sentences with the continued transition, is often a pronoun, has a ton of mentions, they're dispersed throughout the document, it's a person. This region actually has a salience average of 5. They're all 5s, every single one. Region P3, by contrast, is the generic U region. The mean salience there is 0.89, and this contains the most mentions of the generic U. A lot of them are from how-to guides, but not only, and you can sort of see this in examples. So an example of P2, he watched the second hand trotting round the dial of his watch. In fact, the examples in these slides are always the closest instance to the centroid. You can do the same with any entity type. I don't have time to go over all of them, but for example, locations. Here's from travel guides. There's region L1, which typically has predicates about places and travel guides. It's not the only thing that it has, but a lot of these are in there, such as Neyafu town is the center of activity. This is the most important town on the island of Vavau, and this is a travel guide to Vavau. And so it gets a salience rating of 5. L3, by contrast, has non-salient, non-named, short, indefinite place entities, such as what kind of environment could the wild be? Salient 0, nobody mentions this. All right, I'm sort of out of time, so I'll conclude here. I think that linguistic theory has focused a lot on morphosyntactic expressions of salience, and mainly in the intrasentential context, where it's equated with sort of subject prominence. Subjects are surely prominent, but salience at the discourse level is driven by a bunch of different factors that interact very, very strongly. Remember that almost every sentence has a subject, so saying that subjects are salient means almost nothing at the discourse level. It just has no specificity. There's a key distinction that I've tried to make between instance-based, so mention-based properties, and entity-based properties, so ones that apply to the entire cluster of mentions of an entity. And we can aggregate over those, and we can combine those metrics with properties like, was I the subject in this particular instance? Looking forward, I hope that, theories like centering or RST, which often have controversial parameterizations. For centering, it's often been criticized that there are different ways of ranking CF. For discourse trees like RST trees, people have argued that there's a lot of ambiguity, and you could argue about what's the correct analysis. I'd like to hope that this convinces you a little bit of the validity of the constructs in these theories, because I measured salience totally independently of those theories, but there's a strong correlation with these theories. So there's something to them. Inversely, maybe we should be thinking about external properties like salience as ways of operationalizing the best version that we can of these theories. So if somebody tells me there are two ways of thinking about centering, I can tell them, well, which is the one that maximizes predictivity for salience? Because that's a totally independently computed property. This could also be used to resolve ambiguity in discourse graphs as to what is the main structure of the text and what is a secondary overlaid structure, which is something we've done in ERST. And it may also help us to develop new formalisms, because we have a property to explain that is not tied to linguistic form. Of course, I'm not asking you to believe that this is the best operationalization of salience. We could argue about that, so please question the operationalization as well. I've used summaries here. You could do something else. But whatever you do, I hope you implement the analysis that you have in Treebanks, and I hope that that will improve our linguistic theory. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. We have a couple of minutes. We can a bit go over time, so we don't have to rush too much. Joachim.
Thanks for an amazing talk. I have a question about some of the linguistic factors, in particular dependence relation or being a subject and part of speech or being pronominal. I got the impression, I could be wrong, that when you had a small number of factors in the beginning, they were both sort of important, and then as you added others, they got less important. But I thought it was the case that being a subject sort of lost out more than being a pronoun. Is that correct? And if it is, how do you interpret that?
I actually don't know. I don't know offhand. I would have to look at, numbers, whether that is in fact correct. Like losing more could be operationalized as rank or amount of AIC or different things. So we could look at that. It looks like part of speech survives higher here, but remember that the models are very different. So when you look at this versus this, remember that this allows for interactions, and that's a totally different ballgame. When you're in an additive model, you can't make these clever, oh, it matters a lot, but only in this specific corner of the world where, only in the travel guides. And this brings that out. And also, I don't have the same plots with is subject versus a complete part of complete dependency relations, or is pronoun versus complete part of speech. I sort of wanted to give the model everything. So I just gave it part of speech and dependency relation. But I think based on the observation that indirect objects and vocatives are actually more correlated with salience, this is the right way to go. We should stop talking about subjects because that's sort of in our minds, oh, I need to check about this. Why aren't you checking all the dependency relations? Turns out that subject is number 4.
Okay. Great, thank you.
But worth checking. Yeah, I should think about how to operationalize a proper answer to your question.
Thank you. The next question is by Erhard.
Yeah, I very much like this talk. It's really great work.
Thanks.
I have 2 short questions. One, and you mentioned this already in your talk, some of these properties, I'll just pick 2, centering theory, but also RST, are a bit shaky in the sense that RST is known to not yield high inter-annotator agreement, for example, and centering theory, you already mentioned that, why it's a bit noisy as well. So I'm wondering whether this, I'll just call it an ensemble kind of approach, kind of helps heal some of these things, because you have a whole slew of different properties that can sort of support each other, or maybe make up for some deficiency. So that's the first question. The second one is even shorter. You mentioned that summaries might be a good way to kind of glean what might be salient. Now that you have this sort of approach, have you used that to automatically generate summaries maybe not the whole text, but at least sort of have the candidate salient entities that should appear there. I think that would be a very nice application of your work.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. For the first one, it's exactly what I was hoping to evoke as a response in the sort of outlook slide. I think that, yes, these theories are shaky, but even the shaky version of them that we have seems to correlate with something meaningful that's extra linguistic. So that's sort of cool. And B, maybe we can make them, as you're saying, less shaky by considering, if we have, there's people like Manfred Stede who have studied ambiguity in RST terms for a long time. And there's our extension of RST, which is enhanced RST, which allows for multiple non-projective trees over the same data. And there, the question is sort of what is the primary tree or what is the main tree? And correlation with that would be a sort of argument. Similarly, for operationalization of centering. For the second question, we did look a little bit in a previous paper when we only had one summary. So at first we only had one summary, and then we already aligned what things mentioned in the summary, and then we were unhappy that it's binary because they contained a lot of fluff ones like the 3 hours or whatever. And at that time, we did look at controlled summarization. So what happens if you tell the model to do a summary with that kind of entity? And it does raise scores for sort of automated summary evaluation metrics in some circumstances, especially for traditional genres like news. It doesn't always. And also, we sort of got the criticism. I mean, the work was published, but people look at automated summary metrics and say, I don't even know what this means. So you got a higher rouge, you got a higher, BERT score, whatever, but it's really human evaluation. And it's not very clear what a human would consider a good summary. It appears that humans like summaries that are not very informative, that are pleasant to read, like clickbait. And for the summary guidelines for GUM, they're actually very strict about attempting to replace reading the text. So they're very informative, they're very packed with information. And so it would really depend on, I agree that it's an interesting question, but we've only looked at one sort of part way of doing it. And we immediately realized that there are 20 ways of doing this. And you could probably get both a yes and a no, depending on what you're interested in.
I don't see where the microphone goes at the moment. I think it's John. Is that right? No. Tim, sorry.
What role do semantic roles play in salience? Agents, patients, and in a related question is, what about psychological predicates? Are they centering the object more as more salient than the subject?
Yeah, to answer both of these questions, I would need a type of annotation that 2 of our students are actually working on, which is adding a prop banking layer to the corpus. If I had prop banking, I could do 2 things. I would know the senses of verbs, and I would know the semantic labels in terms of agent and patient. I just don't have those. So I can totally imagine that it matters. For semantic role labels, I mean, they're very correlated with dependency labels. So I would expect there to be some similarity and perhaps also some mutual annihilation. But you would be able to see that in metrics. So for example, if you have 2 strongly correlated predictors, then you wouldn't see them ranking high in MDA because the model doesn't suffer much if you remove either one. But you would see a high ranking in Gini because they both contribute whenever they are used. So this is one of the reasons why people use both of these metrics to rank predictors in tree ensembles. So I think you would be able to see an effect. I think overall it would be qualitatively somewhat similar or highly overlapping with dependency labels, but I can't say for sure. I would need the data to find out. There'd probably be at least one interesting finding.
May I add a question to that? This was about the semantic roles, but what about the lexical semantics? It might be too rare in actual corpora, but if you think about like subject or object, to promise or to force, that one of the arguments is more prominent to be picked up. So what is the influence of lexical semantics? Do you think that could be also a factor?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of lexical semantic handles to grab onto right now. We have more for nouns. So we have, for example, we're typed bridging anaphora. So we're working on relations like, meronymy between 2 entities, things like that. For the verbs, because I don't have senses, I can't even assume which reading of ambiguous verbs I'm looking at. But I would imagine that, this sort of actually relates because I think high agentivity is probably related. And we saw that a little bit in that I said, why are plants not, they're living things, but plants don't do anything, right? They don't grow. I mean, they grow, but they don't do much else. They provide shade. I don't know. But there are some contexts in which you find that they are salient. So again, I wrote, I think in the abstract for this talk, no generalization that you can make has zero exceptions. For plants, for example, there are some how-to guides about how to grow plants. So there's one about cactuses in the corpus, and there's one about growing basil and spices. And in both of those, the single most prominent entity is those plants. So there's an exception to everything. And there I would imagine the lexical semantics of the verbs are also the more sedate types, such as growing and.
Thank you. Is there more questions? Maybe just one quick follow-up question. You showed us that genre has a big influence, and if you turn it around, do you think you could derive like, I don't know, saliency or also for reference models or I don't know, theories that take genre more into account based on the empirical data?
Yes. So you mentioned models and you mentioned theories. I think the answer is yes to both of them. For models, I would remind people that the strongest state-of-the-art models on coreference resolution use genre as a feature now, which is crazy, right? All the neural models, if you notice, they have this sort of 5 features. And what does that include? It includes gold speaker label information, which for some reason we think it's okay to give to coreference models. And then they include the genre out of ontonotes, which is, so why do they need that? Well, because the priors are just very, very different, right? And secondly, for theories, there are theories that take that into account. So especially in the tradition of systemic functional linguistics, there's this idea of frames. It goes all the way back to, if you want, Shankian scripts and things like that. There are types of text, types of linguistic interaction that are typical for a certain domain. The most extreme ones you'll find, I guess even in UD by now, in ADIS, right? So you're trying to book a flight or something like that. There are very predetermined participants for that. And it's the same here. If it's a biography, there's the person about whom the biography is. That's unique to biographies. That person is guaranteed a salience of 5 because of the nature of the genre. So I think yes, and there are some theories in that direction.
So I'd like to thank Amir again. Thank you very much for the presentation.